Today we're talking about the compliance training for California, specifically around anti-harassment legislation. My name is Matt Plass. I'm the Chief Learning Officer with Interactive Services. I'm based out of the UK, and I'm joined today by Mark Dorosz, who's our VP of Compliance Learning based out of New York. He's going to be co-hosting with me, and we also have support from John O'Brien and from Neil Cullen in New York as well. So we've got a lot to get through in 30 minutes. We're going to rattle straight through it. I hope you're able to stay with us for the duration. If not, of course, you can get in touch later on, and we'll certainly send out a copy of this deck to anyone who's interested afterwards. So, Mark, I'm going to first of all just to run through a few, a little introductory statement about why we're here.
Sure. So in terms of why we're here today, as a firm, we've been moving into the compliance space with the launch of our Compliance Learning Center, which is coming to market in April, and we have our first clients moving on to it. So just to get us kicked off, California anti-harassment training has been at the bane of a lot of education folks for the past 7 or 8 years now. But there were some changes that happened at the beginning of this year, which in some ways created new challenges for us, but also created new opportunities in terms of how we could approach complying with this particular piece of legislation. So I think this is stuff that we'll all be already familiar with, but in California, anybody who supervises a team of people has been required to take 2 hours of compliance, 2 hours of anti-harassment training, and that happens upon hiring, and then they're also required to take that every 2 years in terms of a refresher. In terms of what's positive about it, the opportunity is that we have to split it into short learning nuggets, so we're not forced to push people through one big 2-hour block. But at the same time, the actual piece of legislation is quite vague around what's expected of us in terms of, it says that it's got to be interactive, and we need to include practical examples, but there isn't a clear list of check the box, as it were, in terms of what we have to cover off as training professionals. So if you just move to the next slide then, Neil, we'll see what changed for us at the beginning of this year. And the big piece that changed was the addition of a requirement to train on abusive conduct. So historically, it was very clear-cut. We were required to train on unlawful harassment, which is an example of a piece of legislation that we could point to and say there are certain behaviors that are not allowed based upon what's codified in law. With the addition of this statement around abusive conduct, what we're essentially doing is expanding what we're required to train on. And that now includes anything that might be taken as an example of creating a hostile work environment. So I think, the big pieces around that would be things like workplace bullying, and then also handling new areas such as how do we deal with social media, which creates a whole plethora of issues for us as training professionals, because our employees' behavior outside of the job in terms of how they use social media can have ramifications for the firm itself. So I think in terms of the challenge for us, it's now a broader piece of legislation that we're required to train on. But the positive is it's gone from a very narrowly defined area around sexual harassment to something that is much more inclusive and comprehensive. So the opportunity for us to create a strong program for managers, I think, is being supported by what we see in this piece of legislation. As ever, it gets more complicated as we think throughout the US itself, and you'll see, Connecticut is a well-known example. They're required to provide that mandatory 2 hours of training, but it only needs to happen once upon appointment of a new manager. Maine requires everybody to go through sexual harassment training, but there's no clear-cut guidance in terms of how long does that training need to be. Once we go into other states, there's about 12 of them, 12 to 15 other states that also have legislation specifically around harassment training. but it tends to be more for specific employees and job roles, the most common example being employees of the state. So I think the message from this is to be aware of where your company operates and to do your due diligence around which states you need to provide training for. So I think that gives us a little bit of background in terms of where we've come from. Do you want to move on in terms of what the opportunity is for us, Matt?
Yes, I do. So we know from our experience developing training that you can actually cover anti-harassment in about 15 to 20 minutes for most employees, and maybe 30 to 40 minutes for if you want a broader course or if you're speaking to management. So what do you do with the rest of the time, and how do you treat this? Do you see it as an issue or an opportunity? And I think we would suggest to see it as an opportunity. When was the last time you had your learners as a captive audience for 2 hours? It's very rare we get them for this length of time. And we can use that time very well. And in a way, the legislation requirement is vague enough to allow us to populate that 2 hours with all sorts of rich content that we think is going to be useful for our audiences. So what we're going to focus on today is 4 or 5 ways that we think will help you make the best of that 2 hours. So the 5 areas we'll look at are assembly, culture, investigation, impact, and attestation. We have some ideas around how you can use these themes to pack your 120 minutes with good content and still meet the regulatory requirement as well. And then at the end, Mark's going to run us through a couple of examples of how we're doing that with our Compliance Learning Centre. So if we look at assembly first of all, one of the great things about the legislation is it highlights 1 or 2 content areas that must be covered, but it actually leaves the rest very open. So if we move on to the next slide, Neil. Here's just a subset of some of the topics that you might look to cover in your 120 minutes. And if you spent 5 or 6 minutes on each of these topics, you'd almost be at the 120 minutes itself. There's a lot to say here, and you could pull in things from outside of this list as well. What I love about the idea of this mix and match approach, if you have the topics available, is you can really think about what's important to you this year. And that might be something that's based on new legislation. It could be based on something that's happened in the industry to a competitor, or it might be something as a result of something that's happened to you in your organization. It's an area that you think this year we really need to home in on this particular piece. Now, obviously, part of this is a topic on sexual harassment. Part of it is a topic on workplace bullying. There's a new piece of legislation out this year which says that has to be included. But it's really up to us about what else we put in. To make this easy, we want to be able to mix and match easily. We want to have those tools at our disposal. So we come each year to 120 minutes and we say, well, let's pull our sexual harassment and our workplace bullying topics in, but then what else do we want this year? Do we want to focus on discrimination? Do we want to focus on the inclusive workplace and perhaps the inclusive manager? So the assembly piece is about saying, what goes in a sexual harassment course, an anti-harassment course? Well, let's widen that out and include all of these different topics and make the most of that 120 minutes and still keep the regulator very happy. So if we move on to the next slide now.
So it's a nice piece about this is it becomes more a genuine piece of leadership training. Whereas before it was almost pitched as remedial or prevention with a heavy emphasis on sexual harassment. By broadening it, I think there's an opportunity to really train on topics that will be of genuine use to a manager, and in that way you're able to tap into intrinsic motivation, as covering these materials actually makes their job easier and covers off scenarios that they realistically could see on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Okay, so the second idea is around culture. We hear a lot about a culture of compliance. We all know how difficult that is to instill. Some companies are lucky enough to have a culture of compliance. Others are working their way towards that. We do know that the manager component is key to creating the culture of compliance. The manager focus is absolutely essential. So what does that mean? Well, it means managers should be able to speak with authority. They should know exactly what the company would like to say about compliance, and they should be able to deliver that message very confidently, and knowing that they're aligned with the company directive. They should also be able to facilitate what can sometimes be quite difficult conversations, and anyone who's designed training for managers will know that this is a big fear area for managers. They love to have a structure for that conversation. That's something that you can provide. So your training in this 120 minutes can also start providing managers with some structures and templates for having those conversations with their staff. I think there's a piece around promoting the culture of compliance. So The conversation from the manager down to the manager's direct reports needs to be around the small things we do every day that help keep the company compliant, rather than avoiding the huge headline mistakes that we see in the newspapers. There's also a great example of modeling behavior, and one of the things you can do in your 120 minutes is show how a manager can, through their daily behavior, model compliance in a way that will engender a culture of compliance. And lastly, one of the biggest problems organizations face with compliance is creating an environment in which people feel comfortable speaking up. Speaking up is not telling tales. Speaking up is not ratting on your colleagues. Speaking up is something we do to keep everybody safe. And as a manager, you more than anybody else can help foster that environment where people feel comfortable raising a hand and saying, I'm not pointing a finger, but I think there's a red flag here.
Speaking up is also a very interesting topic for management, because a lot of the areas that we deal with respect to anti-harassment training is in the grey areas. Those instances where something is cut and dry, you need to bring in the legal team, are almost the extremes of what we see. So when we're thinking about culture, knowing when to ask a peer, knowing when to reach out to HR to say there could be an issue here, rather than waiting until you have a full-blown situation, I think is a very positive action that we can take away from this type of training.
We can. And when we're looking at culture, there are some pretty simple do's and don'ts. I think if you make your learner sit down and do that 2 hours in one sitting, the chances are they'll see it as compliance training. They won't see it as something that fits into their daily life. If you can break it down into short chunks and it's something that they take over a period of time, you can still keep the legislator happy, but what you're doing is you're building it into somebody's day, and you're building it into the culture of the organization. We need to look at principles and values, and we need to focus on behavior change. And the reason for that is you cannot give somebody a directive that will cover every eventuality that they're likely to meet. You have to give them some decision-making tools, and the biggest decision-making tool we have when it comes to compliance is our own values and our principles. It's that sense of, does this feel right, and if it doesn't feel right, what am I going to do about it? That will keep people safe more than giving them a checklist of 100 situations they might encounter. We need to align the training to the workplace culture. Compliance training should feel like part of what we do every day. It shouldn't feel like something I go somewhere else to do, or feel that I've been moved into a different zone to take. And we need to encourage proactive strategies to anticipate compliance breaches. So it's not all about sticking to the rules, and it's not all about what we do to mop up after there's been a mistake. Some of it's about looking further down the road and trying to anticipate, maybe look at the areas where I, as an individual in my particular role, are likely to come across risky areas. Who are the people I'll interface with where the risks could be, and what can I do about that? And in terms of the don'ts, you can teach the specifics of the law, but you're very likely to give people information overload. If it's seen as a box-checking exercise, people switch off. We know this from all sorts of research. And if you exclude senior management from the development process and they don't buy in, then they won't support the program, and the culture will not accept the change. Okay, let's move on. So the next piece is around investigation, and it speaks to what I mentioned just now. We have various compliance policies in all organizations. They tend to be fairly long. They tend to be very detailed and full of legalese. Even the best written policies are not your choice of reading most of the time. So what can we do? We can't ask people to read and absorb and learn every word of the policy, but we can start teaching the behavior that will have them accessing the policy when we need it. We call this a policy hunt. It's about asking the learner within that 120 minutes to go and investigate the policy in order to be able to answer a question or complete a scenario, or engage in a conversation with the manager. So rather than asking them to read and absorb the entire policy, we say, here's a question, and in order to answer it, you're going to have to find the policy, you're going to have to read the policy, you're going to have to find the relevant piece, analyze it, and synthesize the answer that you need for the question that you need to answer in the online training, for example, or for the conversation you're having with the manager. In this way, we invite people to explore their corporate policies. We invite them to investigate regional and role-based differences. So your 120 minutes, part of that might cover the generics that are true across the entire United States, and then there might be a section that says, right, here's 3 tasks that will have you investigating the regional and role-based differences. This means you're going to have to go online, you're going to have to go onto our intranet, find the specific policies, look for the regional differences, and then make some decisions about how these affect you. Another piece here where investigation is very useful is in uncovering war stories. So most organizations talk about having 3 lines of defense. The first line of defense is obviously everybody and their compliant behavior. The second line is people who are actively involved in compliance. These guys have the best war stories about near misses. And near misses are very important because they celebrate people who took compliant action and saved the day rather than mopping up after the disaster.
It's interesting to see historically that training has been that thing that we do once every 2 years. It's a one-off event. With this concept of investigations within learning, we're marrying training to the business. So we're going out, we're interacting with our peers, we're interacting with the actual policies. And once we take that as an approach, it makes it much more fulfilling and an enjoyable learning experience. But it also makes me much more likely to apply what I've learned and start modeling those behaviors in my role as a manager so that a culture of compliance can take root at an organization.
Okay, let's have a look at the next one. So we're going to, in the interest of time, and I do want to get through everything, we'll move a little faster through these. The fourth idea is about impact. So if we move on to the next slide, how do you guarantee impact? Well, whatever the topic you're discussing, and whatever the content is that you're trying to get across, if you have a solid learning model that underpins that content, you can pretty much guarantee that you can present a new concept, you can allow people to practice, you can test for understanding, and you can ask the learner to attest to readiness. And you have a robust training nugget there, whether it's a 5-minute or a 50-minute module. If you have a solid instructional model that sits underneath all of your content, it doesn't have to look like the one on the screen, by the way. There are lots of instructional models that we use and have used in the past, but you should have one. And what that means is whenever you need to teach a new topic, the structure for that topic is automatically laid out for you and the whole thing becomes a lot easier. Move on to the next slide, Neil. What else can we do about impact? Well, I think we're preaching to the converted here. I'm sure every single person on this webinar knows that people love video. In fact, 83% of people said yes, they love video most in a recent survey. What else can we do? Well, why don't we look to get some information and some war stories from peers, from individuals who have faced compliance situations, the inside track, if you like. Let's make this as snappy as possible. Number 3, gone in 60 seconds. These animations and videos, they shouldn't be 3 or 4 minutes long. They should be between 60 and 90 seconds long because that's the impactful period of time. Let's share some tips from the top. Let's find out what senior leaders have to say, and let's make sure that we have some legitimacy with our audience. So let's make sure that what they're looking at has the same kind of design quality that they're likely to see when they're surfing the net in other areas in a social way. Okay, and then if we move on to the next piece is obviously customization. So it's very important that your learners feel like you're speaking to them. They're seeing their people and they're hearing words that feel right for their organization and that they're linking out to the specific policies that affect them. I think the third piece around customization here is let's look for opportunities to celebrate the positives. Most employees, 99.9% of employees, are not criminals. They are not actively looking to breach compliance. They're looking to be as compliant as possible. So our scenario shouldn't only focus on criminal behavior. They should focus on people who speak up and are rewarded in some way for speaking up, and it has no impact on them. 4 is explore the grey areas. Some compliance is very black and white, but some is not. And I think when you get into the area of diversity conversations and into the area of some sexual harassment training, there are some grey areas that need to be explored. Certainly, there are some misconceptions out there that need to be challenged. So don't feel you always have to provide an absolute right and wrong. Sometimes you're looking for a best answer, not a right answer. And finally, play safe. Give people an environment where they can play around with getting it wrong without being penalized. So rather than giving them purely an assessment where if they get it wrong, they have a bad mark and it goes against their final test score, give them a play area where they can answer some questions and where they'll learn just as much from getting it wrong as they might from getting it right. And then finally, we're going to talk about attestation. One of the most powerful tools for getting people to engage with compliance training is asking them in their own words, or at least by selecting statements, to tell you that they feel they're ready. Give them a behavior checklist and ask them to take responsibility for their actions. They've taken the training, perhaps they've passed the assessment, and in that sense they've satisfied the regulator. What else can we do? We can ask them to say, you know, I have read this policy. I can define insider trading. I know what these things are. I know what my designations are. I know how to speak up and where I need to go. I know who to ask for help and how. And when I tick into all those boxes and I click I'm ready, what I'm saying to the organization is I've taken the training and I feel the training has taught me everything I need to know to be compliant. I'm ready. And that's a very powerful message for a learner. So those are the 5 pieces. As I say, we'll send this deck out to anyone who would like it, and we'll also be very happy to talk through some of these concepts in more depth. We're going to spend the last 5 minutes, Mark's just going to walk us through what we're doing at Interactive Services to pull some of these ideas together.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. Just move on the next slide there. I think the first thing to take is there are a lot of ideas that Matt shared with us. We've probably had about 20 tips in total, but it's come from our own research, and it's been the backbone for how we've created our own compliance learning center. So essentially what we've decided to do was to create a library of standalone 6 to 8 minute topics, which you'll see on the right-hand column there. And the idea is that these can be combined to form a large course, or they can also be combined to create small 20 to 30 minute topics. So in its essence, they are the building blocks for you to create an anti-harassment program that is specific to your organization. But then perhaps even more interestingly, you can then mix and match topics to create courses for specific audiences. So we may create a refresher of 20 to 30 minutes of content that goes out to our entire organization. And then we have the big 2-hour course, which is specifically pushed to managers in California. So we're not tied to pushing everybody through the same content. Once we've mixed and matched our topics, I think the real beauty in terms of where we've chosen to focus our attention is around customization. If we just move on to the next slide there, Neil. Rather than customization being that area of groaning around, oh my gosh, we've got to go and we've got to create something specific for our firm, we see it as an opportunity. So in terms of compliance, overall we have a library of 60 topics to pick from, 20 within anti-harassment. And once we've mixed and matched those topics, there are 3 ways that we can make that program specific and relevant to your own business. The first is rapid, which is very simple, which is where we apply your branding, your policy links, and then we have a welcome, which is specific to your organization, so it feels like your own piece of training. The second is the smart customization, which is a concept we've come up with. And in this model, what we're doing is we go through and we look at our program, and then we create screens that are specific to your organization. So what is your internal red flag procedure? What is important to your own culture? What are the markets that you operate on? And we create screens that are specific to your business. We can also switch in imagery that is specific to your business. The nice approach about smart customization is when we update the content on an annual basis with respect to legislation, and on a biannual basis to create a new learning experience with new scenarios, a new look and feel, we simply plug and play your screens. So that update process is very simple. The third level of customization that we're seeing, and this tends to go out for bigger firms, is where we go on, we use some technology, and we can actually go through on a screen-by-screen basis and capture changes to the basic courseware that make it specific to your firm in terms of changing the audio and the on-screen text. When we do that, we are incredibly careful around version control, and essentially we create a gold version of the course that is specific to your firm. We manage it on a year-to-year basis, and anytime anything changes from a legislative perspective, we'll go through and map those changes back to your business. The final option is where we create topics that are specific to your organization. So it might be that we want to look at what is ethical behavior at our firm. What is our reporting structure, and take that as a standalone topic. That's the theory in a nutshell. What does it actually look like in terms of the product itself? The first piece I wanted to show you, we can dive straight into the product itself here, Neil, given time, is let's have a look at a profiler that we've come up with. There we go. So we have the option of running a profiler, which would allow us to run 3 questions so we can work out how long is that individual being with the firm, do they work with customers, and do they work with people. And just before we submit this, Neil, just hold on a second there. We can choose questions that make this relevant to your organization. So we might want to look at where are you based geographically, what are your language requirements, are you a recent graduate, and then based upon that, we can either create an overall compliance learning program for that individual, or we could even tailor it on a course-by-course basis. So if you click Submit here, we're going to see a learning journey that covers the topics that I need to go as part of my annual compliance training. But we can also use that profiler to serve up content that is specific to my needs within anti-harassment, in my anti-harassment training. So my anti-harassment or workplace conduct training will also vary depending upon how I've answered those questions. Let's have a look at the actual content itself. So what we're going to see here is a demo page, and we'll just take a pause if you don't mind for a moment here, Neil. This page will be available to anybody that participated on this call afterwards. And what you'll see here is an overview of our entire compliance learning center. So if we were to say, take a peek at anti-harassment, just scroll down there, you can go in and you can review a curriculum map and you'll see what content we've built here. So just open that up in case people are looking at this afterwards. So we go in, and this document will give you a glance in terms of what's available from interactive services. So just whilst it loads up there. You'll see each of the topics that we have available in this particular suite. And then if you go through, each of these columns here represents a standalone 8-minute lesson, which we can combine to create a traditional course. But you'll see the learning objectives there in the middle there for impact of discrimination, an overview of what we cover in the scenario, and then a description of the assessment. So each of these learning topics has a fully fledged scenario. So it's a really useful piece of detail if you need to share this, say, with your legal or a peer in HR. Let's go back to the actual demo page itself. Why don't we have a look at workplace conduct? So if you go to workplace conduct and then click demo the module, and let's see what we get brought up here. So the first thing you'll see is we started with the Learn It section, which we alluded to earlier on. Let's launch topic 5, violence in the workplace. Just see if we can bring up the audio just here for a moment, Neil.
Work late in public places, or deal with high-risk sectors of the community. Sadly, that's not the case.
Okay, let's just let the audio, we'll kill the audio and let this video play in the background. So what we're doing here is we're starting with a high-impact piece of video based upon those principles that Matt alluded to. We've created this animation to be no longer than 60 to 90 seconds long. You'll see that there's a good range of diversity in terms of the imagery. And then we've avoided actually using video characters so that it's going to work well both with an international audience, so it's low cost to localize into multiple languages. And then also, it's not going to feel dated next year in terms of the imagery. We find we get a much longer shelf life when we have animation like this rather than actually shooting videos, which doesn't really match the production values you might see of a typical Law & Order episode. Okay, so we've gone through our Learn It section, which we'll see there. And then here we're into exploring it in more detail. And in this instance, we've got 5 stories. We find stories are a great way of getting people to relate to content, help to absorb the material. But also, I think this is, what's interesting to state here is all of the text that you see on screen here can be customized. So essentially, we have a template or shell, and we can put in information that is specific to your organization. And I think when Matt talked earlier on, one of the keys to making a program effective and impacting the culture was to make sure the content is as relevant as possible. So you could use these stock scenarios out the gate, but you could also use this screen to talk about your internal red flag policies or anything, or a message particularly from a senior leader that is particularly visible within your organization. Nice piece here is a use of scenarios. Matt, just your thoughts as to why scenarios are such a great way for teaching this stuff.
So I think what you find when you use scenarios is it puts people in the position where they have to make the decision, and sometimes it's a situation that might be very relevant to their role, and sometimes it's very not relevant at all to their role, but it makes them think about real people in real situations, and it allows us to, when we speak about this culture piece, to put people in the situation where it's the small action or the small situation, the one they're likely to actually encounter in their real life that they have to deal with. We very rarely meet drug dealers who are trying to launder money, but we quite often find ourselves in a situation where a gifts and entertainment, for example, decision that we make could put us just on the wrong side of being compliant. And it's those situations where we really need the practice. And the great thing about scenarios is they are practice. You can get it right, you can get it wrong. We're not penalizing people, and you'll learn as much from making the bad decisions as you will from the good decisions.
One of the things I would say about the scenario that Neil's just going through now, and I'd encourage you to take it in your own time, is this very much focuses on the grey areas. And we've also taken a cue there from Trivial Pursuit in the top right, so we're trying to fill in our little pies. But essentially we've got a story that builds. And the important thing to remember about this particular scenario is it's part of the primary learning. So we've moved away from using the scenario exclusively as a test to saying that we're teaching adults, we're teaching managers, and they're more than capable of learning primary content by going through a scenario. So you've seen here, this is part of the primary teaching. We're focusing on the grey areas. Once we go into the assessment itself, which is on the next screen, we're into much more black and white situations. Are these instances that we should or should not report? And the important thing with these is we've got a nice clear legal record. There's no ambiguity into them. I'm either right or wrong in terms of have I assessed the situation correctly. And with it being with a customization, we can also work with you to determine what happens when learners get the questions wrong, how many attempts they get, and what information do we pass back to your learner management system. So I think what we've shown you there, it's a very simple product, but it really is a starting point for creating a program that is specific to your organization. We've got the building blocks. But also if you're an organization that maybe hasn't run a particularly robust anti-harassment program before, you've maybe just pushed out a video, you could release this with limited customization beyond adding your logo, and I think you would get a very high impact piece of training in terms of the level of interaction. Everything you're seeing here is being built in a dynamic framework, so it'll work on a tablet, it'll work on a desktop, and it'll also go back to supporting Internet Explorer 8. So everything that you're seeing here is brand spanking new in HTML5, but it also has a rollback to legacy HTML, so you shouldn't run into any issues if you may be pushing it out to hard-to-reach audiences. In the interest of time, let's go back to the main presentation, but all these materials will be available for you to explore in your own time. There's 7 topics that are available. You'll see at a glance here, this is the whole library that we've got available, which covers everything from anti-bribery through to data privacy, things like HIPAA, and protecting personal information. And then in the middle column there, you'll see anti-harassment and workplace conduct, which is what we can mix and match to create a California-based program. But just to wrap up, Matt, could you maybe just read us through 5 key takeaways that you think we should be
Yeah, and apologies for us overrunning today. The technical problems put us a little bit behind. So 5 things to take away from here. So culture is habit forming. It's about the small things we do every day, the habits that we form that become part of the culture. Impact is about preparing for tomorrow. So we need to be saying to people, this is not an esoteric subject. This is something that affects you every single day, and you need to think about where your risk areas are and look out for them in the coming days. Take responsibility through personal investigation. We can't teach people everything they need to know, but we can teach them the skills to go and find everything they need to know as and when they need to know it. Use that 120 minutes as an opportunity to mix and match what's important to you, and what's important this year might not be what's important next year. The regulation and the requirement for California and the 2 hours is specific enough to tell us that we must have our sexual harassment training and we must have our workplace bullying and a couple of other subjects. What it doesn't do is tell you exactly how to fill that time. That's an opportunity to put in the content that's relevant to you. And finally, ask people to attest with confidence. Get them to tell you that they're ready to be compliant in your organization.
Just finally the last slide there, Neil. And I mean, the message I think I would take away from this is, for us, it's been a real learning experience. We interviewed 60 senior learning, HR, and compliance professionals when we were putting our product together. I think we've got some great resources. If you want to look at them to see how they could fit in your organization, get in touch. If you want to look at what we've built to benchmark your own program, get in touch. We're looking to start a network around raising the bar for compliance training, and we'd love for you to be a part of that dialogue. Thank you very much, everybody who joined us this morning.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.